Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 17, Second Amendment is about national defense, not self-defense. Some excerpts of legal text from the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Powers of Congress. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively, the appointment of the officers, and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Article 2, Section 2. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and of the militia of the several states. Article 3, Section 3. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them. The Founders saw militias as an extension of the full-time Army and Navy. All three, the Army, Navy, and militia, are all called out in the Constitution as subservient to the Commander-in-Chief, the President. The Founders never intended for militias to be a way for anonymous people to hoard unregistered weapons and train to overthrow the government. Overthrowing the government is defined as treason in the Constitution. The militia was intended to operate as a supplement to the full-time Army and Navy, and in times of war would be commanded by the President to repel foreign invasions or suppress internal insurrections as spelled out in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. Congress is given the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. States train the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Also spelled out in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. All of this is reiterated in the legal text of the Militia Act 1792. Section 1. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that whenever the United States shall be invaded, or be in imminent danger of invasion from any foreign nation or Indian tribe, it shall be lawful for the President of the United States, to call forth such number of the militia of the state or states most convenient to the place of danger or scene of action as he may judge necessary to repel such invasion, and to issue his orders for that purpose, to such officer or officers of the militia as he shall think proper, and in case of an insurrection in any state, against the government thereof, it shall be lawful for the President of the United States, on application of the legislature of such state, or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, to call forth such number of the militia of any other state or states, as may be applied for, or as he may judge sufficient to suppress such insurrection. 1. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America, in Congress assembled, that each and every free able-bodied white male citizen of the respective states, resident therein, who is or shall be of age of 18 years, and under the age of 45 years, except as is hereinafter accepted, shall severally and respectively be enrolled in the militia. The Founders intended for the President to deploy the militia in times of war to repel foreign invasion and to suppress internal insurrections. Militias were not meant to cause insurrections but crush them. Every able-bodied man had to register for militia service. It was a kind of military draft. Civilians had to register and provide themselves a list of equipment. States had to train them for possible deployment by the President. There are many clauses in the Militia Act of 1792 that make clear that the militia is an extension of the full-time Army. Section 4, and be it further enacted, that the militia employed in the service of the United States, shall receive the same pay and allowances, as the troops of the United States, who may be in service at the same time, or who were last in service, and shall be subject to the same rules and articles of war. When deployed, militia members were to be paid the same as full-time members of the Army. Pointing again to the militia being a supplement to the Army. Militia members shall also be subject to the same rules and articles of war as the full-time Army, because, again, militias are a supplement to the Army. Several sections of the Militia Act of 1792 deal just with court-martial, fines, and imprisonment of militia members who fail to follow orders. For example, Section 5 says, "Every officer, non-commissioned officer, or private of the militia, who shall fail to obey the orders of the President of the United States in any of the cases before recited, shall forfeit a sum not exceeding 1 year's pay, and not less than 1 month's pay, to be determined and adjudged by a court-martial, and such officers shall, moreover, be liable to be cashiered by sentence of a court-martial, and such non-commissioned officers and privates shall be liable to be imprisoned by the like sentence, or failure of payment of the fines adjudged against them, for the space of 1 calendar month. That the founders spell out a procedure to court-martial members of the militia who fail to obey the President only reinforces the point that the founders saw the militia as an extension of the full-time military. The militia of the respective states shall be arranged into divisions, brigades, regiments, battalions, and companies, as the legislature of each state shall direct, and each division, brigade, and regiment, shall be numbered at the formation thereof, and a record made of such numbers of the Adjutant General's office in the state. Yet more legal text pointing to the fact that the founders saw the militia as an extension of the full-time army, stating that the militia shall be organized in a fashion of divisions, brigades, regiments, battalions, and companies, similar in structure to the full-time army. Section 10. And be it further enacted, that it shall be the duty of the brigade inspector, to attend the regimental and battalion meeting of the militia composing their several brigades, during the time of their being under arms, to inspect their arms, ammunition, and accoutrements, superintend their exercise and maneuvers and introduce the system of military discipline before described, throughout the brigade. Here the founders spell out directly that the brigade inspector shall introduce the militia to the system of military discipline. The Militia Act of 1792 also goes into quite a bit of detail of what equipment militia members must purchase and maintain for themselves. That every citizen, so enrolled and notified, shall, within 6 months thereafter, provide himself with a good musket or firelock, a sufficient bayonet and belt, 2 spare flints, and a knapsack, a pouch, with a box therein, to contain not less than 24 cartridges, suited to the bore of his musket or firelock, each cartridge to contain a proper quantity of powder and ball, or with a good rifle, knapsack, shot pouch, and powder horn, 20 balls suited to the bore of his rifle, and a quarter of a pound of powder. The Militia Act of 1792 then goes on to use a certain phrase several times. Every citizen so enrolled, and providing himself with the arms, ammunition, and accoutrements required, reporting the actual situation of their arms, accoutrements, and ammunition during the time of their being under arms, to inspect their arms, ammunition, and accoutrements, reporting therein the actual situation of the arms, accoutrement, and ammunition. With all that providing context, let's look at the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. The Constitution defines militias as a supplement to the full-time Army and Navy. All three subservient to the President. Congress has the power to determine the method of organizing, arming, and disciplining, and governing, the militia. The Militia Act of 1792 creates a draft for militia service. All able-bodied men must register for service, acquire for themselves a list of equipment, and submit themselves to the state to be trained as militia members with military organization and discipline. The Second Amendment is the bridge between the Constitution that defines militias and the Militia Act that creates a draft for militia service. The Second Amendment protects the right of the individual to serve their country in being drafted into a government-organized militia. George Washington voices this sentiment just a few years before the Second Amendment was drafted. It may be laid down as a primary position, and the basis of our system, that every citizen who enjoys the protection of a free government, owes not only a proportion of his property, but even his personal services to the defense of it, and consequently that the citizens of America, with a few legal and official exceptions, from 18 to 50 years of age should be born on the militia rolls, provided with uniform arms, and so far accustomed to the use of them, that the total strength of the country might be called forth at a short notice on any very interesting emergency. George Washington, in letter to Hamilton, 1783. Washington was a strong advocate for and President of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Just 5 years before, he spoke of how citizens should expect to pay taxes and serve their country in the militia. When the Constitution wrote about militias in 1787, it was with this as a background. The first draft of the Bill of Rights came in 1789, and when it spoke of militias, it was with this as a background. The Second Amendment is about service to one's country. Although it garners much less respect today, service was an important concept when the United States was founded. Every post is honorable in which a man can serve his country. George Washington. This was its original intention, to create a draft for civilians to serve in the militia, and for those militia members to bring their own arms and equipment to that service. For a government that was dealing with massive hyperinflation, a nearly worthless currency that was the Continental, and 10 years with no power to collect taxes, having the individual members of the militia provide their own arms was one way to arm the militia without the government having to first come up with the money. It also encouraged militia members to take good care of their equipment because anything they broke or lost, they had to replace out of their own pocket. Congressman William Vans Murray argued that this mandate to purchase your own weapon for militia service was an unfair financial burden on private civilians, but only 14 members of Congress supported his argument. The Militia Act of 1792 mandated that every militia member buy a musket and other equipment. This financial burden was considered a sort of tax by the government on certain civilians. The Second Amendment is reserving the right to be taxed in the form of buying your own weapon to be drafted into militia service. The Constitution spells out the basic intentions of the militia, regulated by Congress, trained by the state, subservient to the President. The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms in service to your country. And the Militia Act of 1792 spells out how militia service is very similar to service in the full-time army, with the same unit organization, the same discipline, the same pay, and even court-martial procedures for disobeying orders. The Constitution, the Second Amendment, and the Militia Act of 1792, all tie together into a single intention in creating militias that draft civilians into service of their country, supporting and supplementing the full-time army. It's all right there in the original text, in the Constitution and Bill of Rights, ratified by the nation, and in the Militia Act of 1792, passed into law by Congress. And in the words of President Washington himself, the basis of our system, that every citizen owes not only a proportion of his property, but even his personal services to the defense of it, and consequently that the citizens of America from 18 to 50 years of age should be born on the militia rolls. George Washington. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Second Amendment. Now, it takes a special kind of stupid to take all this context, take all this history, take all the words of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Militia Act of 1792, the words of President Washington himself. It takes a very special kind of stupid to take all that context and just throw it out the window, and instead, focus on just 4 words, shall not be infringed. Billy Bob Hayseed fell asleep in all of history class, but popped awake for a few seconds when the teacher read shall not be infringed. This special kind of stupid then ignores all the other words in the founding documents, and screams shall not be infringed means he gets to have an anti-tank gun and any other weapon he wants. Billy Bob Hayseed will argue that any restriction on his desire to buy a gun, such as a background check, registration, restrictions on what weapon he can buy based on deadliness, and so on, are all unconstitutional because he reads shall not be infringed completely without any context whatsoever, stripped of meaning and intent, ignorant of history. This is the thinking of a redneck constitutional lawyer. Timothy McVeigh was redneck constitutional lawyer. In a letter, McVeigh wrote, "Those who betray or subvert the Constitution are guilty of sedition and treason, are domestic enemies and should be punished accordingly." When he wrote this, McVeigh was thinking of people like the ATF agents who investigated the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas for illegal machine guns. McVeigh blew up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 innocent people, on the 2-year anniversary of the fire that ended the siege at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Because McVeigh didn't understand the law, and didn't care to understand the law. McVeigh was a white supremacist and interpreted the Constitution and Bill of Rights in whatever way supported white supremacists. Redneck constitutional lawyers are people not trained in law who reinterpret the law however they want, with complete disregard for context, history, and meaning. If the individual is trained in the law and reinterprets the law however they want, with complete disregard for context, history, and meaning, they are a special kind of stupid called a textualist. Textualists get an entire video of their own. But basically a textualist argues that they can disregard any original meaning in the words and phrases in the Constitution, Bill of Rights, or other laws, and replace it with their own. Textualists believe they can ignore history, and the context that gives meaning to law, and use the words in a game of find the legal loophole. Both redneck constitutional lawyers and textualists will see shall not be infringed, and suddenly every other word around that phrase disappears from sight. Both take the thousands of words in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Militia Act of 1792, and the description of events that caused these laws to come into being, and throw them in the trash bin. Looking at history before and after the ratification of the Second Amendment, it is clear the founders intended for the Second Amendment to be about having arms in preparation for militia service in defense of one's country, trained by the state, subservient to the president. The Constitution clearly defines militias as a supplement to the full-time army. The Second Amendment starts by saying the right to bear arms is specifically about militia service. And the Militia Act of 1792 repeatedly mentions those arms from the Second Amendment as part of mandatory service. You know what isn't in any of these original documents? None of these founding documents have any reference to self-defense. None of these founding documents that spell out how the militia works, what is expected of the militia, who commands the militia, and so on, none of these documents say a single word about self-defense. Because militias weren't about self-defense. They were about drafting civilians into the militia, in service to their country, subservient to the president. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Arms here were vital to the militia. The Militia Act of 1792 mentions the phrase arms, ammunition, and accoutrements 4 separate times. The Second Amendment provided the source of those guns. Civilian members of the militia would have to pay for their own equipment, a financial burden in service to their country, i.e. a tax. The Second Amendment isn't about self-defense. Nor is it about hunting. Nor is it about fighting crime. Nor is it about defending Southern honor as the Nunn case said, nor is it about protection against slave revolts. Nor is it about arming hordes of mall ninja vigilantes who roam the streets, forsaking any duty to retreat. Nor is it about fighting off a passel of 30 or more feral hogs, capable of deboning a cow in 5 seconds. Nor is it about having loaded pistols at dawn, with fragile egos, and tiny hands. The Second Amendment is not a blank check. The Second Amendment is not a wish fulfillment clause. The Second Amendment absolutely positively is not intended to enable and encourage anonymous people to hoard unregistered weapons to train to overthrow the government. And the Second Amendment was absolutely never intended to be about a personal right to self-defense. The Second Amendment works with the Constitution and Militia Act of 1792 to create a militia draft. Nowhere do any of these documents mention any right to self-defense. If you're a textualist, and you see self-defense, well, that's textualism being the con that it is. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.